What about this concern of suffering? What about suffering? Romans, right? You got Acts, then you got Romans. Romans chapter 8, verse 22. Romans chapter 8, verse 22. We know that the whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. Oh, that's a powerful verse, that it identifies with childbirth, a painful process that ends in a glorious climax. Pain that actually produces something beautiful, and life, that's a whole nother conversation. But what Paul is admitting is that nature is groaning, is suffering. We recognize that. Now verse 23. Not only so, not only nature, but we ourselves inwardly, as we wait eagerly for our adoption to sonship, the redemption of our bodies, we are also groaning. We are also suffering. Nature is suffering. We are suffering. The Bible doesn't skip it. The Bible doesn't gloss over it. Let me put it this way. If suffering disproved or proved that there was not a loving God, so disproved a loving God, proved that there was not a loving God, all right? If suffering did that, if the concept that if there's suffering on this planet, it proves that there's not a loving God, if that's the case, then the Bible that was put together to prove that there's a loving God, it seems only sensible that the Bible that was put together to prove that there's a loving God would skip entirely over the question of suffering, because that's the Achilles tendon. We don't talk about that because that will disprove exactly what we're trying to prove. But instead, what you find in the Bible is that it's replete with narratives of suffering and story after story of suffering humanity. So clearly, suffering, at least in the Bible's thinking, is not the one thing that dismounts God from the loving throne. Not it. Suffering. It's a whole conversation we could go into. John Peckham, professor at Andrews University, he'll be here this winter as a guest on our campus. He wrote a book, teaches, unpacking this question, theodicy of love. Can God be a loving God in the midst of all this suffering? And he tracks how free will, that there has to be free will. In order for there to be love, there has to be the option that I choose not to love. In order for my wife to choose to love me, she has to have the option not to love me, or it's not love. It's illegal, and we call it rape. If there's no option, if there's no out option. And so in our relationship with God, if we came to God and God said, sorry, I didn't give you options, I programmed you to love me, it would not be love. It would be forced. And so John Peckham says, look, he puts in his book, if love requires freedom of, and if the rejection of God's love is itself evil, then love requires the possibility of evil. Free will, God gave us free will, not so that we could just choose, but that we could love him. Because without free will, he knew we could not love him. It's impossible. It's a contradiction of terms. C.S. Lewis calls this the greatest miracle, that God would be willing to create with choice. I will not only create you, but I will give you choice. Rather than gloss over or skip the conversation of suffering, the Bible does something unexpected for anyone that looks at all the other gods presented in history and in the world. The Bible presents God as doing something unexpected. Two things the Bible presents the God of the Bible doing that are unexpected in the scope of the gods of this, presented as the gods of this world. Number one, what does he do? The Bible presents God, the God of love, as being willing to enter in to my suffering. All the other gods stand aloof. Hey, I don't want your stuff. You're messed up. You're in pain. I don't want a part of that. But not the God of Scripture. He steps into it. And not just to mine, but into everyone's. Isaiah, the kind of the climax of messianic prophecies, of speaking of the God who's coming to this planet. Isaiah 53. You got it? Isaiah 53. We'll put it on the screen right behind me. But I want to read these 3 verses, powerful verses. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. God hurt. Verse 4. Surely it wasn't just random pain, but surely he took my pain. And he bore my suffering. God willing to step into my pain